Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for May 8th, 2020. Today, we're talking about meat, and usually that would be a pretty awesome conversation in my book. But if you're like me, you've been watching the news, and you probably have heard a number of reports or seen a number of reports about plants having to be shut down, and the results have been lower amounts of supply and higher prices. Now, I'm sure you're not going to be surprised to learn what I learned, but that centralization of power in Washington and federal regulations set the stage for all this to happen over 50 years ago. I'm going to cover that today, but first of all, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We've got a bunch of different platforms we're on, both video and audio. We have live stream on about 5 different video platforms, and we have archive video platforms, and then we have audio-only podcast editions on places like iTunes and Spotify and elsewhere. You can find all of those different platforms and video versus audio, show notes for each episode, including links to stuff that I reference, ways to follow us like our newsletter, email newsletter, and social media platforms, and even how you can support us for as little as $2 a month in our membership program. We make it go a long, long way to support the Constitution and liberty. Find all of that information and more at the show homepage. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Look, I am so incredibly grateful for you spending a little bit of your time with me today, but since it's Fast Friday, I promise to not take up too much of that time. Let's see if I can get through this in about 10 minutes or so. And if you've been listening to me regularly, and you probably wouldn't be surprised, even if this is something new, you're listening to the 10th Amendment Center show, the founders were very, very concerned. And I've talked about this quite a bit lately. The founders were concerned about centralization of power. It's what they called consolidation. They use the word consolidation. And I want to start out with this letter from Thomas Jefferson later in his life to a guy named Nathaniel Macon in November of 1821. And he put it this way: "Our government is now taking so steady a course as to show by what road it will pass to destruction, to wit, by consolidation first, and then corruption, its necessary consequence." So centralization of power was the problem. Consolidation, which leads to corruption and then total destruction of liberty. He says the engine of consolidation will be the federal judiciary. The two other branches, the corrupting and corrupted instruments. And with that in mind, I want to talk about something known as the Wholesome Meat Act of 1967. Here from the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund, they write that this legislation passed by Congress gave the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, the jurisdiction over intrastate meat slaughter and processing, and they say it ranks as one of the worst pieces of food legislation ever passed in this country. And I think just that sentence right there, the fact that the federal government is issuing required regulations over intrastate. Now, mind you, the Constitution for the United States delegates to Congress the power to regulate commerce among the several states. Interstate commerce, regulate does not necessarily mean prohibit, for example, but it does not give Congress the power over things like agriculture within the state. Now, the engine of consolidation being the judiciary, we can go back to a Supreme Court case, Wickard versus Filburn, where in essence the Supreme Court held that growing wheat in your backyard and keeping it on your own property, never putting it into commerce at all, never even selling it, using it for your livestock on your farm or consuming it in your own home, this affected interstate commerce. And so therefore, the federal government could make regulations about it. So I think this really shows how Jefferson's warning really played out in practice, because it started with the judiciary and then other parts, the other branches became the corrupting and corrupted instruments of that consolidation of power. Going further, Farm to Consumer says, the act mandated that meat could not be sold unless it was slaughtered and processed at a facility that was either federally inspected or one inspected at a state whose meat inspection laws were at least as strict as the federal requirements. Meat slaughtered and processed at a state facility could only be slaughtered within the state. So even if they were outside of the federal facilities, they couldn't even let the meat cross state lines. So the feds were basically just dictating how this whole process was going to go. And now some people may say, well, the feds got to come in and protect us and make sure we have good, healthy, quality meat. Well, this interesting report from the Weston A. Price Foundation cites an article from the National Observer back from May 20th, 1968. I believe the law was signed in December of 67, so there was a campaign over the previous summer pushing for it. And this is how they describe what went down. Agents of the federal government fanned out across the nation last July, that's July of 67, under urgent and explicit instructions from Washington to gather examples of horrid conditions in meat processing plants not under U.S. government control. It's fascinating that they say government control, because that's really what it is. They go on, they say swiftly, and often with calculated deception, the federal men got what they were ordered to get. Man, that is some good writing. I wish we'd see more like that today. And they go further. These findings, which were widely accepted as factual and unbiased government inspection reports, I got to say an aside there. We should all know by now that factual and unbiased can't go with government reports. Well, they painted a picture of widespread filth in meat handling. These reports were later to be used as undisputed authority for scare stories that frightened the public and helped stampede Congress into passage of a new and tougher federal meat inspection law, the Wholesome Meat Act of 1967. And I'll just quickly cite John Adams from back when he was one of the good guys in 1776, where he wrote that fear is the foundation of most governments. And this is a great example of how that plays out. Government gained more power, more consolidation that Jefferson warned about, and they used fear, just like John Adams warned about. They frightened the public and stampeded in Congress into passage of it. Now, going a little further, the SBA did a paper in 1971, a few years after it passed, talking about the effects of the Wholesome Meat Act on small business. They presented to the United States Senate Select Committee on Small Business. It discusses, this is again from the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund, it discusses the cost of compliance, mainly the cost of facility upgrades. Now, a lot of people claim that they want more regulations to protect people and that they don't like the big corporations running everything, and the corporations probably don't like those regulations. But the end result is the largest businesses are the only ones that tend to be able to afford this. And we can see how it plays out with the Wholesome Meat Act of 1967 in just a couple of minutes. So they discuss the cost of compliance, mainly the cost of facility upgrades with the requirements of the act, and the effects it could have on small-scale slaughterhouses and processing plants. And here's a couple of highlights from that report of 1971. They say it could be argued that the Wholesome Meat Act was as much of a disaster for many small meat firms as a hurricane. There was little discussion of the effects of the Wholesome Meat Act upon those 15,000 or so firms who now would be subject to rigorous inspection of their product. And they go on, nor was much attention paid to the potential effects of the new law upon competition of the meat industries. They are among the more competitive in the American economy, but the Wholesome Meat Act could lead to a significant reduction of competition. How many firms would have to shut down because they could no longer compete due to the new law? These are the questions that they're asking about in 1971. In essence, a warning. And how has it played out? Here again, a report from 2016. The numbers are not much different today. In 1967, at the time of the passage of the Wholesome Meat Act, there were nearly 10,000 slaughterhouses in the country. It may have been higher than that. And as of January 1st, 2015, the numbers are almost the same now. So from 1967, 10,000. By January 1st, 2015, there are only 2,770 slaughterhouses in existence around the country. So what has been the result? We know centralization of power, more regulations make it more expensive to do business. And when you're doing small scale production, it's much harder. It's an economy of scale. The big boys are the only ones that can really deal with it. So the federal regulations in general attack small businesses put them under, make it cost prohibitive so they can't actually operate, and then the big boys run everything. And you get consolidation and centralization in the marketplace as well. This is an interesting report. Another warning that came out just about 3 years ago, May of 2017, in Bloomberg.com. The title is, "There Aren't Enough Slaughterhouses to Support the Farm-to-Table Economy." So as more and more people are demanding farm-to-table, grass-fed, and things like that, there aren't even enough slaughterhouses to be able to handle this. They have to be shipped to other areas, and the way that they do things, the large factories, that's not what people are asking for. And just some quick notes from that article. They point out that the explanations for the struggles of the small slaughterhouses vary, but inevitably come down to two interrelated factors: regulations that favor large meat packers and uneven enforcement of those regulations. What a surprise. This is how they sum it up. Smaller slaughterhouse operators commonly make claims of disparate treatment and even intimidation by inspectors, because they don't have the financial backing to be able to push back, delay, hire the high-powered attorneys that are needed to deal with the USDA or federal inspectors in any ways, like the large companies do. They go on and say large establishments rack up violations as well. Their non-compliance rate is actually a bit higher than that of their smaller counterparts, but smaller facilities see a disproportionate amount of enforcement. It's a lot easier to gain enforcement and actually do fines and shut people down when they aren't able to defend themselves as well, because they're not as rich. They're not the big companies. And so this is very, very much a centralizing influence. And here's how Mike Meharry put it in an article that we published this morning, talking about how Congress broke the meat supply chain 50 years ago. He says, and as we're now discovering, this centralized system is prone to crack with even a modest amount of stress. So as soon as you have a problem, and I've talked about it many times, in a computer networking system, this is called a single point of failure. You want a distributed system, because if one area breaks down, then other areas can continue operating. Mike goes on, he says, in a decentralized system of 10,000 plus processing plants, we would barely notice the shutdown of less than a dozen facilities. We wouldn't notice the shutdown of a few dozen facilities either, as that number has gone up. In the corporate-dominated business environment incentivized by the federal government, we stand on the brink of significant meat shortages while farmers figure out the best way to kill their animals. It's really, really sad, actually. And he ends it like this: centralized systems are brittle systems. One thing breaking down can shut down the whole thing. He says they lack redundancy. They lack escape valves. They are prone to fail under stress. This is true of supply chains, economies, and governments. Great job on that, Mike Meharry. I will link to that, the article from Weston A. Price, the articles and reports from the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund, and also this. If you really like this kind of topic, you can actually hear Tom Woods. He did an interview about 4 years ago, early May of 2016, with John Moody, who's the executive director of the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund. I will link to that as well. It was episode 656. I'm sure you could probably just go tomwoods.com/656. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope you found it entertaining to watch or listen to. And I hope you learned something. More importantly, I hope you learned something from this show. I hope you are as happy, as safe, as healthy, and as stocked up as can be. And if you like the show, you like what we're doing, you're supporting us, please make sure you can do a bunch of free stuff to help us out. You can smash the like button. You can leave a review, some feedback on any podcast platform. Subscribe, get notifications, depending on what platform you're on. Just take all those actions, leave some comments. And if you want to send me some feedback directly or suggestions for future episodes, you can email team@10thamendmentcenter.com. And as I mentioned at the outset, if you really want to support us, you can pitch in as little as $2 a month in our membership program. That's over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.